October 1944. The Western Pacific Ocean, a place of endless blue, stretching for thousands of miles in every direction. For the pilots of the Imperial Japanese Navy, this vastness was their greatest ally. They believed the ocean itself was a shield that no enemy could fully penetrate. They believed that any fleet attacking their inner defense ring would be exhausted, low on fuel, and tethered to bases thousands of miles away. But on a humid morning in late October, a Japanese reconnaissance plane broke through the low-hanging cloud cover over the Ulithi Atoll. The pilot checked his navigation. He was supposed to be in the middle of nowhere, a desolate ring of coral reefs halfway between the Philippines and Guam. He looked down, and his mind failed to comprehend what he was seeing. The lagoon was not empty. It was not just occupied. It was choked with steel. Below him lay a sprawling, industrial metropolis floating in the middle of the ocean. He counted 10, 20, 50, 100 ships. But as he banked for a wider view, the count rose to 600. There were aircraft carriers the size of skyscrapers, battleships bristling with 16-inch guns. But terrifyingly, they were surrounded by a strange armada of ugly ships, barges, tenders, floating cranes, and massive dry docks. He saw destroyers tied up alongside tankers, drinking oil like wolves at a river. He saw sparks flying from welders' torches on damaged cruisers. He saw a city that had seemingly risen from the depths of the sea. This pilot was looking at Murderer's Row, the U.S. Third Fleet. But more importantly, he was looking at the secret weapon that would doom his nation. This wasn't just a fleet at anchor. This was Service Squadron 10. The Americans had done the impossible. They had detached their navy from the land and brought the harbor with them. To understand why this moment signaled the end of the war, we have to look at the brutal mathematics of the Pacific. War is, at its core, a contest of logistics, and the Pacific theater was a logistician's nightmare. The distance from San Francisco to the coast of Japan is over 5,000 miles. For the first 2 years of the war, the U.S. Navy was leashed by this distance. A task force could steam out from Pearl Harbor, fight for perhaps 2 weeks, and then it had to turn back. It had to return to base to refuel, rearm, and repair. This meant that for every month of operations, a ship spent 2 weeks simply commuting. The Japanese High Command banked their entire strategy on this limitation. Their decisive battle doctrine assumed that the Americans would arrive in Japanese waters tired, with worn-out machinery and empty bunkers. They planned to whittle down the U.S. fleet as it stretched its supply lines to the breaking point. But Admiral Chester Nimitz, the commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet, refused to play by these rules. He knew he couldn't just defeat the Japanese Navy. He had to defeat geography. He called upon a man who had been retired for poor health before the war, a man named Commodore Worrell Reed Carter. Nimitz gave Carter a mission that sounded insane. I want you to build a base capable of supporting the entire U.S. Navy, and I want you to be able to move it anywhere I tell you. Carter created Service Squadron 10. It was a motley collection of converted merchant ships, old tankers, and experimental barges. It was not glamorous. The men of ServRon 10 didn't wear dress whites. They wore grease-stained dungarees. They were welders, machinists, electricians, and stevedores. And in the fall of 1944, they descended on Ulithi. Ulithi was perfect. It was a massive volcanic crater submerged in the ocean, creating a calm lagoon large enough to anchor 700 ships. But it had no infrastructure. No piers, no warehouses, no power plants. Within 30 days, Service Squadron 10 turned this desolate reef into the third busiest port in the world, rivaling the tonnage of New York and London. The scale of this operation defies modern comprehension. Imagine the needs of a city of 200,000 people. Now imagine that city is floating, moving, and constantly exploding things. The first challenge was fuel. A single Essex-class aircraft carrier burned through 100 tons of fuel oil every hour when launching planes at high speed. A fleet of carriers drank more oil in a week than entire European nations used in a month. Carter organized a bucket brigade of oilers that shuttled back and forth from the U.S. West Coast, creating a pipeline of ships. At Ulithi, these oilers acted as floating gas stations. But the Americans didn't just refuel at anchor. They perfected the art of underway replenishment. This was a maneuver that terrified even veteran captains. Two ships, a massive tanker and a combat carrier, would steam side by side at 15 knots, separated by only 50 feet of rushing water. Fuel lines were shot across, followed by high-tension wires for transferring solid cargo. In heavy seas, the ships would roll and pitch violently. If the steering failed for a second, the ships would collide, crushing metal and men. If the tension on the lines was too high, a steel cable could snap, whipping across the deck like a scythe, cutting sailors in half. Yet, the crews of Service Squadron 10 did this day and night, in rain and storms, transferring millions of gallons of volatile aviation gas and heavy fuel oil. They turned the ocean into a highway. But fuel was just the beginning. The fleet needed ammunition. Ships like the USS Mazama and USS Mauna Loa, named after volcanoes because they were packed with fire, arrived at Ulithi carrying thousands of tons of high explosives. They transferred 2,000-pound bombs, torpedoes, and millions of rounds of anti-aircraft ammunition to the warships. During the height of the operations, Service Squadron 10 was moving 40,000 tons of ammunition per month. To put that in perspective, that is heavier than the entire hull of a World War I battleship, moving from ship to ship by hand and crane, in the middle of a swaying lagoon. Then there was the water. You cannot drink seawater, and the boilers of steamships require distilled, pure fresh water to operate. If you put salt water in a ship's boiler, the salt scales up the pipes and the engine explodes. So, the Americans brought specialized distilling ships. These were floating chemical plants that sucked in the ocean and pumped out 300,000 gallons of fresh water every single day. They were the kidneys of the fleet. But the true marvel, the thing that made Japanese intelligence officers question their sanity, was the repair capability. In naval warfare, a damaged ship is usually a liability. If a cruiser took a torpedo to the bow or a battleship suffered a collision, it had to limp back to a dry dock. The nearest dry docks were in Pearl Harbor, 4,000 miles away. A trip like that took a ship out of the war for months. Commodore Carter brought the dry docks to the ships. They were called ABSDs, Advanced Base Sectional Docks. These were monsters of engineering. They were too big to be towed across the ocean in one piece, so they were built in sections. Each section looked like a strange, rectangular barge. They were towed separately to Ulithi and then, in a feat of engineering wizardry, welded together in the lagoon to form a single, massive cradle. When the battleship USS Pennsylvania needed propeller repairs, she didn't go to Hawaii. She steamed into the Ulithi Lagoon. The massive ABSD flooded its tanks and sank down into the water. The 35,000-ton battleship was guided over the submerged dock. Then powerful pumps roared to life, pushing the water out. Slowly, incredibly, the dock rose, lifting the entire battleship out of the ocean. Japanese observers could not believe reports that battleships they claimed to have crippled were back on the firing line 2 weeks later. The ABSDs at Ulithi repaired destroyers that had their bows blown off. They fixed carriers that had been ravaged by kamikazes. They replaced 60-ton gun barrels. Work crews on these docks lived in a world of blinding blue light and deafening noise. They worked 24-hour shifts under floodlights that turned night into day. The lagoon glowed so brightly at night that it could be seen from the stratosphere. It was a beacon of industrial arrogance. The Americans were so confident in their air superiority that they lit up the ocean like a carnival. And speaking of arrogance, we must talk about the food. Napoleon said an army marches on its stomach. The U.S. Navy believed a fleet runs on morale. And for the American teenager 5,000 miles from home, morale meant one thing: ice cream. While Japanese garrisons on bypassed islands were literally starving to death, resorting to eating rats, snakes, and even grass to survive, the U.S. Navy commissioned a ship dedicated to dessert. It was a concrete barge, designated BRL. It had no engine. It had no guns. It cost $1 million in 1945 currency. Its sole purpose was to manufacture ice cream. This floating factory churned out 10 gallons of ice cream every 7 minutes. It had freezer storage for 2,000 tons of vanilla, chocolate, and strawberry. It was towed around the lagoon, pulling up alongside destroyers and cruisers to deliver sweet treats to the crews. Imagine the psychological impact on a Japanese prisoner of war. You have been told that America is weak, that its supply lines are cut, that your spirit is superior. Then you are captured. You are brought aboard a destroyer. You are dirty, starving, and terrified. And then, a sailor offers you a paper cup of cold, fresh strawberry ice cream. In that moment, the propaganda dissolves. You realize that your enemy is not just winning. They are living in a different universe of resources. But life at Ulithi wasn't just ice cream and welding. It was dangerous. The lagoon was technically a war zone. And the Japanese did not let this floating city go unnoticed. In November 1944, the Japanese launched a desperate covert attack. They deployed Kaiten human suicide torpedoes. These were modified torpedoes piloted by men sealed inside, destined to die in a fiery explosion. A submarine released them outside the reef. Most of the Kaiten pilots suffocated or crashed into the coral, but one managed to slip into the lagoon. It struck the fleet oiler USS Mississauga. The explosion was catastrophic. The ship was fully loaded with aviation fuel. A pillar of fire erupted into the night sky, visible for dozens of miles. The lagoon turned into an inferno. But here, the American system showed its resilience. Within minutes, tugboats and firefighting ships swarmed the burning oiler. They couldn't save the ship, but they saved many of the crew and, crucially, they contained the fire. The next morning, the fleet didn't panic. The train kept moving. The repairs continued. The Kaiten attack, which cost the Japanese precious resources and trained pilots, was a pinprick against a juggernaut. Then came the typhoons. The Pacific is violent. In December 1944, Typhoon Cobra struck the fleet. It was a monster storm with 100-knot winds. It sank 3 destroyers and damaged dozens of other ships. Nature did more damage in 24 hours than the Japanese Navy had done in months. But unlike the Japanese fleet, which would have been crippled for a year, the Third Fleet simply retreated to Ulithi. Service Squadron 10 went into overdrive. The floating dry docks worked around the clock. Bent masts were straightened. Crushed hulls were patched. Within weeks, the fleet was back at sea, ready for the final push. By the spring of 1945, the invasion of Okinawa began. This was the Typhoon of Steel. It was the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific, and it required the fleet to stay at sea for unprecedented lengths of time. Thanks to the floating city at Ulithi, the U.S. Fifth Fleet stayed on station for 79 consecutive days. They didn't retreat to resupply. The supply came to them. Admiral Spruance, the victor of Midway, watched the endless stream of supply ships arriving from Ulithi and remarked, "The delivery of supplies to the fleet has been the greatest secret weapon of the war." Japanese kamikaze pilots threw themselves at the American ships in waves of hundreds. They inflicted terrible damage. They turned the decks of carriers into slaughterhouses. But the Japanese were fighting a hydra. For every ship they hit, Service Squadron 10 repaired one. For every plane they shot down, the jeep carriers brought 5 more replacements from the rear. The Japanese fought with the courage of the samurai. They had pilots willing to die for their emperor. They had brilliant tacticians. But they were fighting a 19th century concept of war against a 20th century industrial machine. They thought war was about the sharpness of the sword. The Americans knew war was about how many swords you could manufacture, transport, and sharpen per hour. When the war ended in August 1945, the Ulithi Lagoon was packed with the greatest armada in human history. Carrier after carrier, row after row of battleships. A force so powerful it could have challenged the rest of the world combined. And then, almost as quickly as it appeared, the city vanished. After the surrender, the Service Squadron packed up. The dry docks were towed away or scuttled. The barges moved on. The personnel went home to their families in Ohio, New York, and California. Today, if you fly over the Ulithi Atoll, you will see a quiet, pristine paradise. The water is turquoise. The beaches are white. The natives fish in the lagoon in small boats. The only trace of the floating city are the rusting skeletons of a few sunken oilers on the bottom of the lagoon, slowly being consumed by the coral. But the legacy of Service Squadron 10 changed warfare forever. It proved that logistics is not just a support function, it is the primary combat power. It proved that a nation that can build a city in the middle of the ocean, treat its wounded in floating hospitals, and serve ice cream on the front lines, cannot be defeated by courage alone. The Japanese pilot who looked down in shock that day in 1944 didn't just see ships. He saw the end of the age of empires and the beginning of the age of superpowers. He saw the undeniable, crushing weight of a war won not by the soldier's bayonet, but by the welder's torch.